Chapter 13. The Center Crumbles. When Menelik's troops ran the gap between the Albertone and Dabromida brigades, they won victory for Ethiopia at Adwa. Immediately, Ras Alula saw an opportunity that was not to be lost: the utter annihilation of the Italian army. He dispatched a courier to Menelik with a message to send the Oromo cavalry to block the passes from the east, trapping the Italians by closing their line of retreat. For whatever reason, prudence or unwillingness to repeat Dogali on a massive scale, Menelik demurred. With a decision that saved thousands of lives and a few shreds of dignity for a defeated army. Although the battle was effectively over, the fighting was not. Baratieri was improvising, desperately looking for a way to save his army. Baratieri's assessment of the situation told him that sending the army forward would put it at risk of destruction. Instead, Baratieri had ordered Dabromida's brigade into a position where he thought he could provide cover for Albertone in retreat. Then he arrayed his remaining forces at the two passes. If Albertone could successfully disengage his forces, they could seek safety in the secure defensive positions Baratieri had established. Such a plan meant effectively occupying the passes and the flanks of Mount Rayo. This Baratieri did by ordering Arimondi's brigade into position at around 8:15. Arimondi's deployment at the passes was a scaled-down version of what Baratieri had intended for the entire army. Now, with the Albertone and Dabromida brigades positioned well ahead, control of the passes would be the responsibility of Arimondi's men and Elena's reserve. As Arimondi's troops took up their positions, the weakness of Baratieri's original plan became evident. The ridge that extended from Rayo was quite narrow and steep on either side, making it very difficult for the troops to deploy effectively. Some units took up positions that put them at an oblique angle to the line of attack. The slope was so awkwardly steep that artillery had trouble finding a stable platform. Moreover, the rise approaching the Italian positions was uneven and covered with shrubs, providing cover for advancing troops. Baratieri himself took a position high on the flanks of Rayo, giving him a commanding view of his own troops and one of the ascending valleys up which the Ethiopians would advance. General Elena's reserve brigade, which was still arriving from Gundapta, was ordered to occupy a position toward the rear, to be moved forward as the fighting developed. Arimondi's soldiers were light-hearted as they took up their positions. "They won't get away today," shouted one. Francesco Frisina, recently arrived from Italy, was typical of the youthfully exuberant soldiers gleeful at the prospect of proving themselves in battle against the enemy they woefully underestimated. Frisina's joyful attitude evaporated when he turned to look behind him. There he recognized General Arimondi sitting on the ground, elbows and on knees, face in hands. Although Frisina would later see Arimondi confidently giving commands, the general had already telegraphed his misgivings. Stragglers and pursuers. Just as Arimondi's men were settling in, their battle abruptly began. At 9 o'clock, African soldiers began running toward the Italian positions. They were not Ethiopian soldiers. They were Askari in full retreat. Their flight marked the beginning of the collapse of Albertone's brigade. Turito's advance guard, the 1st Native Battalion, had come under withering fire after walked into the Ethiopian encampment. When facing Askari units, Ethiopian riflemen targeted their European officers. Take away the head and the creature dies. The officers, recognizable as much by their complexion as by their uniforms, were among the first to fall. Soon 7 were on the ground, dying. Under intense fire, its officers depleted. The 1st Native Battalion began to break up sometime after 7 o'clock, retreating in disorder back toward Albertone's position. Albertone's officers sought to rally them, and succeeded with a few. Others paused but eventually pushed through, racing east toward the pass, past Arimondi's forces on Rayo and on toward the camp at Saria. By 9:30, Albertone and his men knew that there would be no reinforcements. They were likely still unaware of Dabromida's movement to cover their right and their retreat. They were in the final 90 minutes of their share of the Battle of Adwa. By fanning out and attacking the flanks, Ethiopian infantry had turned the fight against Albertone's brigade in their favor. The Ethiopian flanking movements were creating nearly a half circle of convergent fire, while the Italians were forced to spread their fire across a widening perimeter. Ethiopian infantrymen took advantage of terrain, vegetation, dead angles, and speed to move up to the Italian right. They occupied the flanks of Adivici and Monosiato, conical peaks a mere 2,000 feet from the Italian artillery batteries. From there, they opened fire on the artillerymen. A few well-aimed artillery shots chased them from their positions, but the distraction opened defensive holes at the center, where Ethiopian troops scurried closer to the Italian front lines. By 10 o'clock, the situation on Albertone's left was becoming tenuous. For a moment, some of the Italian soldiers thought the battle was about to enter a lull, but suddenly masses of fresh troops joined the assault on the Italian left. Ernesto Cordella, artillery lieutenant, spotted 100 multicolored flags, accompanied by beating drums and the hearty cries of soldiers puffed up for battle. For the Ethiopians, it was sheer joy to be engaged in a battle where numbers could finally make a difference. For the Italians, the effect was deeply more demoralizing, for although they could force the Ethiopians to take heavy casualties, the supply of Ethiopian troops seemed limitless. Dozens would fall, but dozens more would take their places. And that is how the end came for Albertone's brigade. As the Ethiopians attacked the flanks with renewed vigor, they created new opportunities for the Ethiopian center to advance. There was no shortage of targets for the Italians, but the sheer number of targets diluted their fire. Ethiopian soldiers were not famous for their marksmanship, but as Ethiopian infantrymen moved closer to the Italian positions, they fired with greater effect, picking off the men who operated the artillery and the infantry who defended them. Attrition began to set in on the Italian side of personnel, as artillery officers were forced to work the guns themselves as their soldiers fell, and of ammunition, for there were plenty of targets but not enough shells. Lieutenant Ernesto Gardella took his place along Mohammed Aga Adam and Sultan Aga Ahmed, loading and aiming the guns as they fired the last rounds. From his perspective among the artillery pieces, Lieutenant Cordella watched the decay and collapse of the 8th Native Battalion, which was protecting his position on the right. The Ethiopian envelopment was nearly complete. They were firing on the Italians from the front, from the sides, and even from high ground to the rear. By 10:15, they were picking off the remnants of the 8th Battalion. When the order to retreat was given is unclear. Gerardo Pantano, a lieutenant fighting on Albertone's left flank in Major Valley's 7th Native Battalion, claimed to have received an order to retreat around 9:30 from Captain Pinelli. Pinelli had ordered a retreat by echelons, not because the battle was lost, but merely in order to disengage in favor of a position to the rear. One wonders whether the time is correct, since the concerted assault on the Italian left didn't begin until 10 o'clock. Other evidence and the flow of the battle itself suggest that the call to fall back came later, closer to 10:30. By then, a combination of casualties and departures had reduced the 8th Native Battalion to mere remnants. Sometime around 10:30, with both flanks verging on collapse, General Albertone gave orders for the 3rd and 4th Mountain Batteries to hold their positions until their ammunition was exhausted. The remaining ammunition from the other batteries was put at their disposal. In effect, they were being asked to sacrifice themselves to cover the retreat. With the 3rd and 4th Mountain Batteries holding, what remained of the 8th Native Battalion was ordered to retreat, followed by the 7th and then the 6th. By 11 o'clock, the artillery pieces were firing their final rounds. Cordella was taken prisoner, along with gunners Mohammed Aga Adam, Sultan Aga Ahmed, and Idris Tutai. General Albertone, wounded, was surrounded and gave himself up. His capture was one of the greatest prizes of the day. Of those whose retreat they had bravely covered, many were cut down. Ethiopian marksmen consistently targeted Italian officers. So by the time the retreat began, rank-and-file soldiers had little guidance. By all accounts, the retreat was disorderly. The men were exhausted, in shock, and hotly pursued as they raced back toward the passes. They blew past Arimondi's brigade, deaf to the bugle call to halt, indifferent to officers waving revolvers threateningly. Most followed path back to the camp at Saria, and from there north toward Ertura. More than 200 would die along the way, victims of their pursuers and an insurgent population. Among the survivors, many were beginning a long journey that would end days later after many close calls. Sergeants De La Torre and Pepe endured a retreat that lasted more than 2 weeks. The retreat began on March 1st and ended on the 16th, where they stumbled into Asmara, shoeless, indeed naked from head to toe. The triumph over Albertone's brigade boosted Ethiopian confidence, but it came at a cost. Italian fire had devastating effects on the Ethiopians. The number of bodies writhing in pain or falling silent in the broad plain that had once divided Albertone's forces from Menelik's provided ample evidence of the bitter contest and the body-shattering effects of Italian artillery. They will never know how many Ethiopians died. The bodies were not counted. Albertone's men had suffered too. Eduardo Ximenes was part of the mission to the battle site a few weeks after the event. He found more than 80 dead where Turito's men had fought their desperate and solitary fight. 110 where Albertone's men had stood their ground, another 200 on the path of retreat, in all more than 400 dead out of the brigade of 4,000. While the Italian forces were quite literally decimated, the Ethiopians suffered higher casualties. Defense and collapse at the passes. In retreat, Albertone's brigade followed the road that led to the northern pass, pursued hotly by Ethiopian infantry. Arimondi's men watched helplessly. They dared not fire on the Ethiopians for fear of hitting the askari, indistinguishable from their Ethiopian pursuers. The close chase meant that hundreds of Ethiopians would arrive within close range of the Italian center without facing hostile fire. The fleeing soldiers were unstoppable in their panic, insensible to commands or threats. In pursuing Albertone's fleeing ranks, the Ethiopians threatened to push beyond the passes and close off the path of retreat. At the same time, the strong column of Ethiopian forces that pushed between Dabromida and Albertone began to occupy a high hill, Zebandaro, opposite the Italian forces on Rayo. How the importance of this high ground had been overlooked is unclear. It may be that the Italians simply discounted the possibility that it could be scaled until they saw the Ethiopians begin to scale it. Colonel Francesco Stevani ordered the 2nd Bersaglieri Battalion to contest the high ground threatened by the Ethiopians, to no avail. They faced a murderous fire as they clambered up. A mere 40 Bersaglieri reached the summit, and the first was gored by a bullet to the face. He fell backward, coming to rest with his face to the sky. The remaining soldiers returned fire before being picked off, leaving the Ethiopians in control of the hill. Arimondi's left flank, where the 3rd Native Battalion of Colonel Galliano stood, was also challenged with a fierce assault and withering fire. Within 20 minutes, by 10:30, they had lost half of their officers to Ethiopian marksmen. Leaderless and presented with the example of headlong retreat by Albertoni Saskari, the 3rd Native Battalion collapsed in uncontrolled flight. As the 3rd Native began the retreat, the 8th Mountain Battery somehow managed to set up their guns and began to fire, covered by a company and a half of Bersaglieri. While this move momentarily shored up the Italian left and center, the Italian right, at the northern path far more vulnerable, was coming under intense pressure. Relentless fire from Zebandaro in front and enfilading fire from the flanks of Ishasho were having devastating effects. Ethiopian soldiers found good positions behind rocks and bushes on the high ground some 300 feet above the Italian lines. Italian infantrymen returned fire from a kneeling position. Giovanni Tedone, sergeant in the Bersaglieri, couldn't help noting how the Italian officers who commanded standing beside their soldiers made ripe targets. Their bright sashes of red or blue screamed officer to Ethiopian marksmen, who obliged by cutting them down. Of 610 officers at Adwa, only 258 returned. Italian fire was very effective, but sheer numbers were having their effects. As Ethiopians fell, others took their places with a courage that forced the Italians to remark, echoing Baratieri, that they despised death. Ethiopians fired the rounds with smokeless gunpowder from hidden positions. There was a hail of bullets, recalled one soldier. Bullets ricocheted from every direction, whistling, screaming, howling in our ears, such that we couldn't tell from where they came. The Italian position was rapidly becoming untenable. Colonel Stavani, in an admission that did nothing for morale, declared, "Today is a second Dogali." As the Bersaglieri abandoned their position, they attempted an alternating covered retreat, whereby each company took turns covering the retreat of the others, but because they were deprived of many of their officers, coordination became difficult. Order soon broke down, and the retreat became a rout. As Tedone would later describe it, it was no longer a fight, but a slaughterhouse. It was not yet a slaughterhouse at the center, where by 10:45, Baratieri was making his final demands on the reserve brigade commanded by General Elena. With his right collapsing, Baratieri knew that the outcome of the battle depended upon Elena and his reserves. If they couldn't halt the Ethiopian advance toward the pass, we are all lost. But much of Elena's reserve had already been deployed, and a mere 2 regiments remained. They might slow the advance, but would never halt it. By 11 o'clock, Ethiopian troops had pursued their envelopment to the point that they occupied positions beyond the Italian flanks. Ethiopian troops pushed through the southern pass at Kidane Meret, driving east, then sweeping north toward the plains, threatening encirclement just as new Ethiopian contingents were taking up positions on the flanks of Ishasho, seeking to control the northern pass. It was 11:30. Seeing the danger and seeing his officers fall wounded and dead around him, Baratieri ordered a flag unfurled as a rallying point. He raised his officer's saber, crying, "Viva l'Italia!" The signal for retreat was sounded, though heard by few over the din. Baratieri began making his way down the slope of Rayo, his retreat covered by the 9th Battalion, the 1st and 2nd Bersaglieri, and the artillery battery, which held out until noon. His retreat through the northern pass was covered for a time, and the movement of Italian troops retained some semblance of order for around 2 miles before breaking down under relentless pursuit from the Ethiopians. Many of the Italians had not eaten in hours, nor had anything to drink. Thanks to their nighttime march, they had had little or no sleep. With their officers cut down, many units were leaderless. The retreat rapidly came apart, with clumps of soldiers doing whatever they could to escape the pitiless Ethiopian onslaught. Some headed east, back toward the camp at Soria, others went directly north to Eritrea. Even Baratieri's flight had all the marks of a haste and panic. Pieces of his official correspondence fluttered over the plain at Gundapta, mute orders abandoned to chance. Round 3, Dabromida's battle. With Albertone's brigade broken and the army at the passes in retreat, the fate of General Dabromida's brigade was yet to be decided. From the moment around 9:15 that morning when Dabromida observed the strong column of Ethiopian soldiers shoot the gap between his position and Albertone's, he was cut off from the rest of the army. His day unfolded almost as independent combat. General Dabromida was an officer and a nobleman. Anything but the soldier. Dabromida thought it unnecessary to tell anyone the position General Baratieri had ordered him to occupy. His men might well have questioned him, had he ever given the slightest hint that he would allow it. The mysteries of the morning start with the fact that although Dabromida knew that Albertone's forces were engaged, an errant round landed near Dabromida's men as a timely reminder. The movement of Dabromida's brigade was painfully slow. Why Dabromida chose the route he did, indeed, nearly everything about his behavior that morning, is information that he carried to his grave. By 9:30, Dabromida's men had taken up their positions in Mariam Shavitu Valley. 2 artillery batteries stood at the center, protected by an infantry battalion on either side, the 14th and 5th battalions, respectively. A little forward and to the left, the 6th and 10th infantry battalions, under Colonel Ottavio Ragni, defended adjacent high ground. The 13th Infantry Battalion and part of the 3rd were held toward the rear in reserve. Although Baratieri's intent for Dabromida's brigade was clear, link up with Albertone in order to support him and cover his retreat, Dabromida's isolated position offered neither possibility. The valley Mariam Shavitu is hemmed in on 3 sides. On the left and on the right are ridges that rise high above the valley. Behind them are the steep western extensions of Mount Ashasho. General Dabromida had marched his men into the tactical equivalent of the bottom of a tin can. The tin can tips to the west, facing Makonnin's camp and the tens of thousands of Ethiopians eagerly preparing for battle there. The rise in elevation southward from the valley, combined with the significant distance, rendered any link-up with Albertone's forces to the south difficult. This simple fact was confirmed when Dabromida ordered a militia battalion commanded by Major Davito to reach out to General Albertone and his forces on the left. The native troops under Davito's command, impressed by their isolation and shaken by the size of the Ethiopian forces in front of them, could only ask, "Are the white troops coming?" The question captured the situation perfectly. The only way Dabromida's position made sense, given their isolation and the disproportion of forces, was if the rest of the army moved up to fill the gap between Albertone and Dabromida. The Ethiopians attacked Davito's battalion, seeking to decapitate it by concentrating their fire on their officers. De Vito himself was among the first to fall, and the battalion soon found itself overwhelmed. After a firefight of no more than 20 minutes, De Vito's battalion was obliged to fall back hastily toward the core of Dobramida's forces. They left behind 12 officers wounded or dead. The speed and force with which the Ethiopians pushed back De Vito's battalion ought to have told Dobramida that he would be of no use to Albertones in his current position. Emilio Bellavita, who fought under Dobramida's command at the Battle of Adwa and lived to tell the tale, pointed out that the lack of contact with Albertones' forces, even visual, ought to have clued in on Dobramida's about his mistake. A more agile mind, as he put it, might have recognized the error and corrected it. But Dobramida, Bellavita implied, was too stubborn to admit his error. But was it a mistake? It would be easy to dismiss Dobramida's behavior as incompetence, but it is not the only explanation, nor even the most plausible. Sometimes the best explanation is the simplest, that Dobramida was exactly where he wanted to be. That is, an impatient and frustrated Dobramida, like Albertone and perhaps in collusion with him, sought a decisive encounter with the Ethiopian army. He interpreted Baratieri's orders loosely by pushing on into the valley of Mariam Shavitu. The brigade-sized gap left between Dobramida and Albertone would serve as an invitation to Baratieri to fill it by sending Arimondi's brigade forward. Indeed, Albertone's bulletin of 7:30 that morning move up the Arimondi brigade in reinforcement. It would be quite opportune to move up the Dobramida brigade, which would draw to itself a part of the enemy's forces, had urged just such a course of action. Such a scenario would suggest collusion between Albertone and Dobramida to hijack control of the battle from Baratieri. Alternatively, but less convincingly, it was surmised that Dobramida intended a diversion. Giuseppe Manarini, a captain who, like Bellavita, fought beside Dobramida at Adwa, suggested that Dobramida foresaw that a bold Garibaldi-style attack at the Mariam Shavitu would draw Ethiopian forces away from the attack on Albertone's position. Thanks to Dobramida's selfless diversion, the Ethiopians would have to divide their forces between the Albertone and Dobramida brigades, thus diluting their impact. As it turned out, there were plenty of Ethiopian soldiers to go around. This rendered moot any notion of a selfless diversion. At the same time that Mekonnen and Mangesha directed their strong column toward Albertone's right and beyond, they prepared to attack Dobramida's center. Ethiopian infantry, covered by Oromo cavalry, charged Dobramida's artillery. This simple move pinned Dobramida in place like an entomology specimen, giving him no opportunity to reconsider his folly. With Dobramida immobilized, the Ethiopian army moved to defeat first Albertone, then Arimondi. Later, they would turn their full force against Dobramida. For the remainder of the morning, Dobramida's forces would acquit of themselves reasonably well, in part because Ethiopian attention was focused elsewhere. While Ethiopian forces consolidated their positions in front of Dobramida and the high ground to his left and right, and Ethiopian and Italians continued to exchange rifle and artillery fire, Dobramida could reassure himself that he was in control of his sector of the battle. At 12:30 p.m., he wrote a bulletin to General Baratieri informing him that his forces had turned back 2 frontal attacks. Dobramida had no way of knowing it. But by the time Baratieri was on his way back to Eritrea, Dobramida and his men were orphans. Toward 9 o'clock that afternoon, there was a noticeable lull in the fighting. Some of Dobramida's soldiers allowed themselves to believe that the battle was over. They ran about, firing their rifles and shouting, "Victory! Long live the king! Viva l'Italia!" But as their cries echoed across Mariam Shavitu, they were reminded that they were still isolated and without reinforcements. They wondered about the rest of the army, from which they had had not a word. Then, famished and thirsty, they drank from the canteens and cracked open meat tins. A few hundred yards away, the Ethiopians prepared their final attack of the day. They passed out ammunition and gathered all available forces. Ethiopian soldiers scurried forward, seeking their cover behind bushes, deep ruts, and breaks. Then the fighting resumed. Italian soldiers, shooting from kneeling or prone positions, complained that they couldn't even see their adversaries. The skin of the Ethiopians blended with the dry brown earth. When the Ethiopians opened fire, smokeless gunpowder made it hard to determine who was firing or from where. And the fact that Ethiopians fired at will rather than in volleys meant that there were no auditory clues as to their whereabouts. The popping of rifles, like the bullets themselves, seemed to be coming from everywhere. Ethiopian riflemen concentrated their aim on Italian officers who commanded while standing, offering fine targets of themselves with their uniforms, plumed helmets, and colored sachets. Italians would later claim that the Ethiopians were poor shots, but it hardly mattered. Even when they missed, stray bullets hit the soldiers standing near them. And so the fighting of early afternoon went. The Ethiopians were in no hurry. Having dispatched the main Italian force, the outcome of the day was ensured. The Ethiopians would seek to position themselves close to the Italian lines, using their advanced positions to pick off officers and other targets, while the Italians, whose fire was effective at greater range, sought to prevent the Ethiopians who crawled or scampered forward from getting close. As a practical matter, this meant that the Italians were obliged to undertake bayonet charges from time to time in order to clear the ground in front of them. The 6th and 10th Battalions carried out successive bayonet attacks against forces threatening Dabromida's left flank. At the center, Colonel Iragi led successive attacks, urging his men forward aggressively to clear the field of sharpshooters. For well-rested men, charging over such uneven ground would have been exhausting. For men who had been marched all night, it pushed them to their limits. By mid-afternoon, the fight had shifted decisively in Ethiopia's favor. Meanwhile, it was dawning on Dabromida that something was terribly wrong. He murmured to himself, "This is serious. Serious." And not a bulletin, not an order, no reinforcements, nothing. For the first time, Captain Manarini noted Dabromida seemed nervous. The sound of rifle fire to the left and slightly to the rear drew Dabromida's attention. Askari pointed toward the high pass Dabromida's brigade had used to enter the valley that morning. Oromo cavalry, having completed their pursuit of Arimondi's central column, were returning to the fight. Behind them one could see clutches of infantrymen, dozens, then hundreds, descending on a path that would soon bring them into the battle. Dabromida turned to Colonel Arigi. "I want to attempt another charge. Who knows, maybe reinforcements will arrive in the meantime." Aragi couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was sometime around 3:30, more than 6 hours since the last contact with Baratieri, and Dabromida was holding out hope that reinforcements were on their way. Aragi's look of disbelief prompted Dabromida to add, "And if reinforcements don't arrive, the assault will permit us to begin a retreat." Aragi passed the order on to his remaining officers. He knew that what his men were being asked to do was nearly beyond them. Horns sounded the assault. Aragi raised his helmet and cried, "Savoy! Long live Italy!" To their own surprise and the surprise of the Ethiopians facing them, the men found the strength for a final charge. Given that the outcome of the combat was in no way at stake, the Ethiopians gave way, then opened fire at close range. Italians' casualties were horrific. The long retreat began with cries from the wounded, begging not to be left behind. Ras Arula, Ras Mangesha, Ras Mikhail, and the Oromo cavalry were now threatening from the high ground to either side of Dabramida's brigade. The charge had put Dabramida's forces deeper into an Ethiopian pocket. It only increased the exposure of the Italian flanks, which now collapsed. Dabramida himself was soon surrounded in a whirl of hand-to-hand fighting. Basha Gebre was in a group of soldiers who closed in on the old man. They watched as Dabramida used his officer's revolver to shoot 3 of Basha Gebre's comrades. Dabramida then turned to fire at Gebre, but he took cover behind a tree. When Dabramida swiveled to face other attackers, Gebre stepped from behind the tree and delivered the final shot. The bullet entered Dabramida's chest from the side, below the right shoulder, and tore his officer's sash as it exited the left. Dabramida, who had expressed the desire to die, rather than return to Italy after such a humiliating campaign, had gotten his wish. Dabramida's body was stripped. His white-handled officer's saber was one of the great trophies of the battle. Gebre would later present it as a gift to Menelik. End of part 1.